This lesson today is going to be for November 1st, and it's called God Acts. The one true God is incomparable. He will complete his plan to save his people. In Isaiah 46:3-13, it indicates God has a plan and it is committed to it. His plan is to save his people, and nothing will keep him from accomplishing this plan of salvation. Not even the hardest of the people will be saved. I can remember when I was growing up, we had people that were, grew up Catholic, and we had a lot of people that didn't really live by the Bible. So, I tried talking to them, and eventually, years down the road, they came back and told me thanks, because kind of straightened themselves out some. Then Isaiah goes on in 42. Being the first of these songs, Isaiah 42:1-9, introduces the servant of the Lord, saying, "This is my servant, this is my chosen one, I delight in him." God chose Abraham and his descendants to be the blessing in every nation. However, as a nation, the Lord rebuked Israel for failing to fulfill this purpose. Therefore, God would do with Israel what it failed to do. He would rise up one of the nations to fulfill his purpose to bless all the nations. In chapters 42-44, Isaiah's message revolved around 4 proclamations. The first was that God would intervene on behalf of his people. Even though they are spiritually blind and deaf, the Redeemer of the Holy One of Israel would bring about a new exodus, bringing his people out of the Babylonian exile. The second was an exhortation to listen to and obey God's word, because he was the one who would remove their sins. Third, the Lord was their salvation. The fourth proclamation was that the Lord is sovereign over all the nations and superior to all their false gods. Isaiah declared that Israel needed to remember these people, and he would never forget them. God chose to glorify himself through his people. While the nations formed their gods, Yahweh, Israel's Redeemer, formed his people. God promised Israel that he had chosen to use Cyrus to rescue the people and to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. When the nations witnessed what God had done for Israel, they would recognize the futility of their gods and that the God of Israel is the one true God. The Lord's call of salvation would go out to the nations. In chapters 46-47, Isaiah described God's judgment on Babylon. God's judgment on Babylon would be severe because of how harshly Babylon treated the people of God. God also recognized many of the people of Israel and had an outward religion without true devotion to God. But God offered them a new beginning with their deliverance from Babylonian exile. Now we're going to explore the text. The true God says, "Listen to me, house of Jacob, all the remnant of the house of Israel, who have been sustained from the womb, carried along since birth. It will be the same until your old age, and I will bear you up when you are turned gray. I have made you, and I will carry you. I will bear and rescue you. Who will you compare me to, make me equal to? Who will you measure with me so that we should be like each other? Those who pour out their bags of gold and weigh out their silver on scales, they hire a goldsmith, and he makes it into a god. Then they kneel and bow down to it. They lift it to their shoulder and bear it alone. They set it in a place, and there it stands. It does not budge from its place. They cry out to it, but it doesn't answer. It saves no one from this trouble." And then in verse 3, in contrast, Bel and Nebo, two of the main Babylonian gods with the Lord, similar to the Canaanite title of their god. Baal and Bel means Lord, and it was a title the Babylonians gave to their patron god. Marduk, they believed, Marduk was the king or lord over all the other gods. Nebo is the Hebrew translation of the son of Marduk. The nobility and intellectuals. He was the God of wisdom, writing and divine interpretations. Nebo appears in the name of Nebuchadnezzar, Mount Nebo, the place where Moses scanned the promised land before he died. He got his name from this God. Okay, accordingly, these false gods themselves would be carried into captivity alongside their worshippers. The irony is that the climax of the Babylonian festival for the New Year was a procession where they carried out idols of a temple accompanied by religions. He had sustained Israel, who put them on his back and carried them. By necessity, beast and bird carried the Babylon gods, whereas the Lord himself carried his people through the entire course of their existence. The gods of Babylon did not compare to the God of Jacob. In verse 4, there came a point when parents can no longer carry their children. However, the Lord promised that his tender loving care for his children not only began before they were born, but that it would also continue through their infancy, their childhood, and their adulthood, on through old age, when their hair turns gray. They would never become a burden to him. His arms would never tire. He made them. He would carry them as his load, lift them up, bear them, and in doing so, rescue them from the Babylonian captivity in which they were finding themselves. The Babylonian gods would be unable to come to the rescue of those who worshipped them, much less save them from going into captivity. However, the Lord would faithfully care for his people and save them. Here's a good question. How might we describe the difference between idols that are carried out or God carrying his people? How does God carry his people today? Idols can't do anything for you, but you can, when you listen to God, do as he asks, he will take care of you from now until the end of time. Then we go on to verses 5 and 7. In verses 5 through 7, the Lord mocked the idols of Babylon along with the craftsmen who made them. In verse 5, he began with a rhetorical question asking, who can compare to him? In verses 6 and 7, he diversely concluded that certainly those who hired skilled workers to make idols, the artisans who actually carried them idols, and idols themselves did not compare. The Lord's four rhetorical questions in verse 5 serve as declarations. No one compares to me. No one is my equal. No one measures up to me, and no one is like me. In Hebrew, normally a threefold repetition of the same idea is the way to express superlative emphasis and the most of utmost. The use of four statements was the Lord's way of saying his incomparability and even beyond that. Just as it is impossible for people to comprehend the idea of thinking of something greater than the greatest thing, they are capable of imagining. The trustworthy one. Remember this and be brave. Take it to heart, your transgressors. Remember what happened long ago. For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and no one like me. I declare the end from the beginning, from long ago, what is not yet done, saying, my plan will take place, and I will do my will. I call a bird of prey from the east, a man from a purpose from far country. Yes, I have spoken, so I also bring it about. I have planned it, I will also do it. In verses 8 and 9, the Lord told his audience to remember this. To what does his refer? It refers to what happened long ago. All the magnificent things God had done for them. If they would have listened to his command, they would know that Yahweh was the only one who was trustworthy. If the people would just think about the importance of idols, remember what God had done for Israel, even before its existence, it would strengthen their faith and give them a proper perspective. The scriptures clearly teach the importance of the people of God remembering what he had said and done. For example, Moses told the Israelites to remember how God led them and provided for them for 40 years in the wilderness. God instructed the Israelites to set up memorial stones to remind the people of his faithfulness. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was a memorial of what God did to save Israel from bondage in Egypt. Excuse me. Just as the Lord's Supper is a memorial of what Jesus did to save us from our bondage to sin, God commanded these transgressors to take it to heart. He called them transgressors because they deliberately disobeyed. God, and they disobeyed God and were unfaithful to Yahweh by worshiping idols. Take it to heart means the people needed to seriously consider all that God had done. God commanded them to do what? David did remember God's works and reflecting on them. If only the people in Isaiah's day would have listened and done what David did, God told them that it truly remembered what he had done for them in the past. Then, like David, they would have to recognize what the Lord emphatically stated. Certainly he is God. There is no other and no one is like him. God is not figuring things out as he goes. He does not act on a whim. Excuse me. These verses describe what the incomparable God is able to do. First, he foretells the events before they happen. It is evident of his omniscience. He knows what is going to happen ahead of time, and the Lord revealed the future through his prophets. Second, the Lord accomplished what he plans to do. The past, present, and future all proceeding according to God's purposes. The Lord has a plan, and he will carry it out down to its finest detail. God is not figuring things out as he goes, and he does not act on a whim. God is sovereign. He will do whatever is his pleasure, and no one can thwart him. In verse 11, God provided evidence of his sovereignty, and part of his plan was to use King Cyrus of Persia. God would cause Cyrus to come and conquer the Babylonians. He would be God's instrument of judgment and carry out what Yahweh intended. His purpose, Cyrus would swiftly fly in like a bird of prey and defeat his enemy. The Lord concluded this verse with two parallel statements of emphasis. I have spoken and I have planned it. Both statements confirm God's established will, and the statements I will also bring it about and I will also do it were emphatic ways of saying he can count on me to do it. Here's a good question. How should God's omniscience and sovereignty over all of history be a source of strength and hope for our believers? If you listen to or read the Bible and understand what God has done all through the ages, you'll understand that he's got a plan, he's working it, and he doesn't forget. And he says, listen to me, you hard-headed, far removed from justice. I am bringing my justice near. It's not far away, and my salvation will not delay. I will put up salvation in Zion, my splendor is Israel. God then promised to bring his justice near to them, declaring that it was not far away and his salvation would come quickly. Salvation would come to God's initiative by his mercy and grace. The people would not do anything to deserve it. It would be the Lord's righteousness and the Lord's work of salvation, and it would be for his splendor in Israel. These words to Israel are similar to words of the Apostle Paul spoke to the Romans as he reminded them that salvation was near and was available to those who confessed and believed in Jesus Christ. And that's the lesson for today.